It's been more than 50 years since Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the United States. We reached that anniversary this month. After it was overturned in 2022, lawmakers here in New York have tried to expand protections by enshrining abortion in the state constitution and putting funding into the state budget for abortion care providers. They have also tried to help residents beyond the borders of New York. In the past 2 years, state lawmakers and the governor secured funding in the state budget to support abortion providers and passed a law allowing providers to prescribe abortion medication via telehealth to out-of-state residents where there are abortion bans. We sat down with State Senator Shelley Mayer to talk about how these measures will help address the issue now and what the legislative priorities will be this year at a time when another Trump administration heads to the White House. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So this month marks the anniversary of what would have been more than 50 years of Roe v. Wade since it was overturned in 2022. Consequently, many individuals around the country are feeling nervous, scared, and some even hopeless. What do you have to say to New Yorkers who might not be feeling so optimistic, and how are you feeling around this anniversary month?
Well, first place, I don't think we should diminish how it felt to have a right that we believed was constitutionally ours as women taken away after 50 years. It was really like striking in the heart. Some women cried, some women got angry. Most women said, what are we going to do about it? And for me, thinking about the women that I know that are not involved in politics, not involved in government, but are fearful that they can't handle a pregnancy, that they can't support a new baby, that their life is tumultuous already, that they may have other young children, that they and their spouse or their partner want to have a reasonable conversation early on in pregnancy. To think that that is not a choice that those women have, particularly those that don't live in states like New York, that's a problem, a serious problem. So I'm glad that we in New York have taken really strong steps to protect the right to abortion here as it was defined in Roe v. Wade. We did that right away after the decision came out, and then we've done other things. And so I'm confident and I feel good that we live in New York, but it should not be simply where you live or where you're born that determines what your rights are.
And as you were saying, I hear from the Democrats a lot that New York is a leading state on this front, but with the new Trump administration heading into the White House, consequently making a lot of individuals around the country nervous, what does New York have to look out for, and what are the priorities going to be here in Albany for this legislative session?
First is the very good news that we passed the state's Equal Rights Amendment, which puts in the New York State Constitution, not just in New York law, the protected right to reproductive health care, including abortion as defined in Roe. So that's a whole different thing. People don't understand once something is in a law, if the legislature changes, it could be changed. The governor changes, they could change it by executive order. Lots of things can happen. Once it's in the Constitution, it's so much harder to change. So that's why it was so important this year to pass this Equal Rights Amendment. And we faced all this blowback, which was really largely, in my opinion, inaccurate and misleading and full of political innuendo. It had very little to do with the real choices that women make and need to have the ability to make. So we passed that overwhelmingly throughout the state. And that will protect in the New York State Constitution the right to reproductive health care here in New York, not only for New Yorkers, but for those who physically come here. And then we've done some other things, as you know, through telehealth to try to ensure that women in other states have these rights as well.
And so what will the priorities be this legislative session? Do you have any bills on your mind of further protecting reproductive freedoms or birth control access?
I've already introduced one bill that deals with amending or building on my telehealth bill. And that bill that we passed and the governor signed allows licensed New York doctors and providers to prescribe medication abortion, which is more than 50% of abortions nationally, to women in other states, particularly in these red states, where literally even early in your pregnancy, you're prohibited in some states from having an abortion, from any of the access to reproductive health care. So we already have that. But what has happened already, the Attorney General of Texas has sued a doctor in New York for sending these pills to Texas. And so my new bill would change the labeling on those prescriptions that are sent to not necessarily have the doctor's name, but the practice name, so that we are guaranteeing the safety and security of licensed New York doctors who are doing what they are authorized to do under New York law, from being sued, prosecuted, or criminally prosecuted by other state attorney generals.
And so do you think that will help potentially prevent more lawsuits? As you know, lawsuits have come in from the telehealth bill. So will this, I guess, help providers and protect them a little bit more, like you were saying?
Well, I think it's likely that this case by the Texas Attorney General will wind its way up to a higher court. And we knew that when we passed this bill, which other states have now done very similarly, and they've done this Prescription Protection Act that I'm talking about now, other states have done as well. So I think ultimately we're going to have to put our faith in the courts. And that's a difficult thing to do given this Supreme Court. But we believe we passed a constitutional law when we allowed this to happen. This is in New York. It is New York doctors. And all they're doing is sending you a pill to get to your home in whatever state. But for me, I think about the woman in Kentucky, the woman in Alabama, the woman in Tennessee, who really has no choices, is not going to physically be able to come to New York. We are doing our best in a legitimate constitutional way to ensure those women have access by using these New York doctors. And we're going to do everything we can to protect these New York doctors who are doing what they believe is not only their obligation, but their rights under New York law.
And why do you think this issue should continue to be a priority? I often hear from different lawmakers that, we've done enough on this front and that we don't really need to do anything else, that there's enough reproductive freedoms in New York. What do you have to say to, I guess, that argument, and why do you think this should continue to be a priority?
Well, first place, that argument was used for years. We don't need the Reproductive Health Act. I remember I was here as a staffer. We don't need it because Roe will never be overturned. So don't bother amending the penal law, which is where originally the provisions about abortions were, and putting it in the public health law. Finally, we got that passed. Then once Roe was overturned, it's never going to bother New York, and we fought for the constitutional amendment. These are important things. The fact that people say it's not going to happen, we've been proven wrong on that. It did happen. We lost a right that women thought was theirs. And I'm not talking about women who identify as Democrats or liberals. I'm talking about regular people who find themselves in a difficult situation and want to have control over their own destiny. That was taken away. And so New York has to do what it must do to be a leader in this area.
And for New Yorkers who may not know, how will the Equal Rights Amendment protect them in the Constitution should we see potential federal threats on reproductive freedoms?
Well, it depends what happens at the federal level. I mean, some federal laws obviously are preemptive of state laws, and we're mindful of that. There are things that Congress could do that would make it very hard for us to use this state constitutional protection. But short of that, if there's efforts by any state agency or outside agency of government to do things that limit the right of access to reproductive health care, including abortion and miscarriage care and all the other parts, let's not forget that, of reproductive health care, we have a remedy. We are going to have to be right on top of our toes to see what happens federally and respond promptly and to be in the lead, which I'm confident in New York with my colleagues and certainly with Majority Leader Stewart Cousins, and I'm sure the governor and Speaker Hastie and my other colleagues, we're going to be in the front of line to doing what we have to do. This is not a minuscule issue. This is an issue of the deepest personal part for a woman. I always talk about that. This is not like some abstract thing. This is personal. This is like, I've met over the years many people who would never define themselves as pro-choice, who thought they had this right, and their granddaughters had this right, and now they don't under federal law. So we're going to do everything to protect those women.
And what did you make of all the controversy around the ballot language when it came to the Equal Rights Amendment? How do you think that impacted voters as they headed into the polls in November?
Well, I was in a district where those that were anti-Proposition 1 used all of these issues of the language, girls' sports, having medical procedures without parental consent. And I had to absolutely confront each of these arguments as being inaccurate under the law. And I did. And also there was a whole activist group of women who literally went and educated people who didn't know about this amendment to push back against this sort of barrage of inaccurate information. I'm very, very pleased at how well we did. But it wasn't just by nature. It was by organizing, by advocating, and by educating people that this misinformation was in fact inaccurate. You're going to retain the rights you had, and many of these rights already exist under New York law already, but we're putting them in the Constitution now to make sure they're good.
And as you know, Republicans have filed lawsuits against the Equal Rights Amendment when before it had gone to the, or even during the process of trying to get it on the ballot. What do you make of that controversy? Do you think that will continue even after it's been officially approved by voters?
Well, it was approved, and it's effective immediately. People can sue. You know, I was in the Attorney General's office. The state of New York gets sued every day. The world doesn't end because someone threatens a suit or brings a suit. But we rely on courts to make reasonable judgments based on the law and precedent. And New York law is strong on these issues of constitutional rights, and we have now made it even stronger. So I'm confident in the New York place that we'll be okay. But it is this possibility of federal action that we have to be on our toes.
And how much of that will play into legislative session, the looking out for federal action? How prepared are you, I guess, and have you had discussions like off session about that?
We have been talking to the advocates. We have people who are sitting in Washington watching every day what happens, and particularly once, you know, President-elect Trump becomes the president, whatever actions he takes by executive order, through the agencies, around Congress, that is, for me, the greatest fear. Congress is a long, cumbersome process. Yes, the Republicans have the majority, but not all members of the Republican majority in the Senate or the House are in a rush to make abortion the centerpiece of their work. They recognize that, again, even in conservative districts and with the women who are not political, these are personal issues. They need to be very, very mindful of sticking into. So we're going to watch the administrative process, the regulatory process, and the congressional process, and be ready to respond promptly when things happen.
And do you think we'll see more efforts in the state budget? The governor last year put the Abortion Provider Support Fund into the budget, established that. Do you think this year we could see more money put into that or more efforts to bolster the provider fund on that?
I hope so. And I hope that money is spread among those who, equally among many who are providing care. Many of these doctors who are providing prescription abortion medication by telemedicine are not able to charge the clients, the patients, the amount it costs simply to send the prescription. They can't afford it, these women. And so they do it at their own cost. The doctors are doing it out of their pocket. They ought to be compensated for the cost of these medications and the sending and the mailing so that they are not losing. And right now that has not occurred. We need the law to be modified so that they get some of this money and we add more money to that pot.
And how do you think those conversations might go throughout the budget? I know that the budget has a lot of competing priorities, but do you think that will be something that's widely supported?
I think so. I think, again, most of my colleagues dealing with their constituents recognize that they want to support these efforts of New York to be in the lead. And I think the Democratic majorities in both houses will be very clear on that. And they want the funds to be available to those who are out of pocket for doing the work that New York authorizes.
And do you think there's more the state could be doing to address access to birth control? If so, will that potentially be a priority this legislative session?
I think one thing we ought to do in that area is be mindful that other states are ahead of us. Other states are doing even more than we are doing to make access to birth control, over-the-counter medication, as much as possible. In New York State, we should be in the lead on that. There's been a conversation about sex education in schools for many, many years. We have not moved that bill. I think there may be a time where we're going to have a bigger conversation about how we inform young people in high school about the risks, particularly of pregnancy. So I think there are things we can do, and that we are a step behind some other states, and we need to continue to be talking, as I do, with our other state partners and looking at best practices. New York we're not the leader in everything. I hate to tell people this.
And how much of a role do you think this issue will play during legislative session? I know there's many competing priorities, as you know. How much time do you think this will take, and how will you prevent it from getting lost in translation?
It's not going to get lost. This issue cannot get lost. This is a fundamental personal right. My number one fight is to get money for every public school, and I'm not going to lose that. But at the same time, this is a personal right, a right of your body, your decision that we had. That's unbelievable that we don't have a right that we had before. It's not going to get lost in the sauce, I can assure you. And not just women. The men, I think, in our conference, and frankly, I suspect many of my Republican colleagues at the end of the day are not anxious to go home and explain to their constituents that they reduced a right that has already been eliminated by the Supreme Court. And shame on that court for misleading the members of the Senate about their positions on Roe. That is really unconscionable to me. But this is where we are, and we as New York leaders in this area are going to make our voices heard, and we're not going to drop it.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. That's unfortunately all the time we have for today. We were speaking with Senator Shelley Mayer.
Thank you very much.